If I wanted to create a paramilitary force that served as my bodyguards and were fanatically loyal to me and nobody else, how would I do that? That is a question that can be answered if we take a look back at history. This is for historical and educational purposes. So, when we're looking at the question of how do we create a fiercely loyal paramilitary force that can patrol domestic areas and be completely and blindly faithful to whoever their leader is. A perfect example of how that was cultivated is available to us when we look at World War II era Germany. When we look back at World War II era Germany, one of the key things that helped keep the mustachioed dictator in power was the SA and the SS. So the SA were known as the brown shirts, and the SS was later the surveillance and enforcement arm of the dominant party in German politics in the 30s. When you look at how the SA were formed and recruited, early on, the SA were largely made up of ex criminals, unemployed people, and former military that really didn't have anything to do. So they were combined and structured into an enforcement and paramilitary, sort of a police adjacent force. Their main purpose and function within the party at the time was to suppress and intimidate any opposition as much as possible to pave the way for the dominant party to gain power. As that regime gained more and more power, you saw the role shift a little bit, and you saw the SA, the brown shirts, get redefined or redeployed. Eventually, they lost their influence to the SS, which became the dominant force in German enforcement and surveillance during that time. And that force in particular were selected based on their racial and ideological purity, as well as their willingness to have blind and fanatical obedience to the dictator in charge. Does that ring a bell? They were primarily used as a terror and enforcement arm designed to keep opposition subdued and under control. So if you're seeing and recognizing some of the parallels between how that paramilitary force in the German World War II context was brought forward or constructed and deployed to what we're seeing today with certain uses for ICE and other events, you're on the right track. So if I wanted to do the same thing and I were president, what would be the things that I would do? Well, I think one of the first things that I would do is pardon all of the insurrectionists who tried to overthrow the government from January 6th. And that is exactly what the felon in chief did on his first or second day in office. He then released 100 domestic terrorists and criminal defendants who were involved in January 6th. And what's interesting about that pardon is that it completely obliterates one of the narratives that's been common within right-wing circles, which was the whole J6 event was a cooked up deep state plot that combined the deep state, the FBI, probably aliens, and Antifa. That was the story. Well, if that was the case, why were all of these people pardoned? Isn't it interesting that the Back the Blue crowd is cheering the fact that domestic terrorists and people who assaulted police officers and killed a few of them are cheering this on? And another historical context, some historical context to kind of put things into perspective. More people died as a result of the events of January 6th than during the Boston Massacre. That is stunning, isn't it? And these so-called patriots are the ones that are cheering. But what does the release and pardon of these 1,500 domestic terrorists signal? A lot of these people are members of the Proud Boys, members of Oath Keepers. There are probably some Patriot Front people that are in there as well. And what this signals to their collaborators and fellow traitors in and around the US is that it's open season for them to do whatever they want. So this sets up the foundation for the creation of a private domestic military or paramilitary force, obedient and loyal only to the felon in chief. So that's just one piece of the puzzle. What else do we need to consider? One of the other things that we have to keep in mind is that this action that happened just on the first and second day of the felon in chief's administration is part of a broader play and broader pattern of behavior where he has consistently excused the behavior and activities of white nationalist groups. You saw it in Charlottesville. You saw it with his comments about plenty of good people on both sides. You saw it in his administration where national security threats from domestic terrorism were brought up to his attention, and he refused to enforce or act on any of those threats that involved white nationalist groups. And that's because white nationalist groups and allies of white nationalist groups represent a big segment of his base. So in addition to that, what else do we know that indicates a signal of things to come? Well, one of the things that we have to pay attention to is that one of the key people, Matthew Belanger, who was a white nationalist, was arrested and imprisoned. And this was a neo-Nazi who plotted a mass extermination event, has now been set free. And he's on home confinement, and he was put in jail for threatening journalists. He's been linked to at least one murder. This is not a good person. And he was trying to incite a race war. And once the home confinement piece of his sentence ends, he's in the wind and he can go back to doing what he was doing before. And this isn't an isolated incident. You have example after example of ex-military, ex-police, and everywhere in between, these people aligning themselves with far-right and Nazi-aligned factions. And this would be the recruiting pool that I would wager the felon in chief is looking at as part of his paramilitary force and enforcement arm. We're seeing the early stages of this militarization of domestic, formal domestic and informal domestic paramilitary forces with ICE enforcement raids and all of that sort of stuff. When you see that escalate, all it takes is a little bit of pushback and you'll see the mobilization of these white nationalist groups to lend additional support. And that becomes a critical piece of the puzzle or critical stage in where we're going to go from day one of this regime into the future. Because if we don't forcefully stand up and push back against that militarization and those attacks against the most vulnerable, we're in for some very dark times. One of the other things that I think is worth pointing out is the operating philosophy and behind the scenes of all of these white nationalists and paramilitary groups that are so-called patriots. Let's call it what they are. And this is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. We need to call these things out for what they are. They are Nazis and Nazi-aligned groups that want to bring back a U.S. society that is similar to 1930s Germany. And their motivations and methods were detailed in a recent ProPublica article, The Militia and the Mole, and I would recommend that everybody read that as well. We are in a period of time in history where we have an opportunity to act in a way that heads this off. Every single one of us has sat through history classes. Well, maybe not those in MAGA because they're mostly illiterate and probably dropped out of school after the 8th grade. Everybody else sat through history class in grade school and high school and in college and asked ourselves the question, how could the German people allow all of that to happen? Well, the reason they allowed all of that to happen is because none of them had the courage to stand up and speak out in mass as this was rising. And we are still at that stage where it isn't a foregone conclusion that the outcomes that we're driving to are going to be the same outcomes that the dictatorial regime in World War II-era Germany drove to. Right now, everybody is talking about mass deportation. And that was the same language that was used in that era of Germany. And when it was discovered that mass deportations were inconvenient, what happened next? There were work camps and concentration camps that came up afterwards. And what do you see today? You see those being built all across the southern states. You see the increased construction of private prisons, and that all provides free labor for the billionaire class. That is the path that we're on right now, but that doesn't mean that we have to stay on that path. What it means, and the way that we head this off, is understand what is confronting us in the moment and resist the urge to cower. It's going to take everyday citizens to stand up and push back and fight back, be seen and be heard, and take action against the jackbooted thugs that are going to be parading in the streets, hoping to take out any brown or black face that they see. It's on all of us now, because as we've seen, the media lacks a spine, the billionaire class doesn't care, and they're actually actively enabling this. So when the elites and the 10% and 1% are all on one side, that leaves us, the 90%, to fight the battle that needs to be fought. Anybody else that isn't on our side and aligns with the billionaire class, those are the true enemies within, and we need to be vigilant, and we need to make sure that we're acting with purpose.